When you're about to make a decision, what process do you go through to make sure that it's the right one for you? Well, if you work for the Government of Canada, one of those processes is likely a gender-based analysis. This is something that all the federal government departments and agencies are expected to do before they implement any policy. A gender-based analysis to make sure that no one is going to be marginalized, either a man or a woman, by what's contained in that policy. Now, the idea of GBA, as it's known, goes back to about 1995. So this is not a new concept. It was something that was on the books during the Jean Chrétien era. But in 2015, the new government had a renewed commitment to GBA, a renewed commitment to making sure that no genders were marginalized because of any government policy, because it's the current year. Well, even though this is a 20-year-old policy, the federal government is still trying to pay people to explain it to its own employees. Looking at a contract list from an access to information request with the Department of Finance, I saw that a little over $2,500 had been awarded for other professional services to a woman named Carmen Paquette. Now, Carmen Paquette is a former Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. She is an activist. Her profile identifies her as a Franco-Ontarian feminist, also very well regarded in LGBT circles because of her barrier breaking as a gay woman in Ontario. And she was also hired by the Department of Finance for $2,542 to do GBA training. So to go in and talk to the finance department, not status of women, but the finance department about government policy. Now, I got a hold of her actual presentation here. I'm going to show you some elements of it here. What I found most interesting is that in the presentation wasn't anything particularly new. It was reminding government employees of what they should already know if it's on the books as government policy. But I want to talk about the actual policy itself. So on international.gc.ca, which is the federal government's foreign affairs portal, basically, they explain quite publicly what GBA is, what a gender analysis is. An analysis of gender relations can tell us who has access, who has control, who is likely to benefit from a new initiative, and who is likely to lose. Gender analysis asks questions that lead us in a search for information to understand why a situation has developed the way it has. It can also lead us to explore assumptions about issues such as the distribution of resources and the impact of culture and traditions. Now, the presentation from Carmen Paquette also talks about similar themes, looking at what GBA is. And she says in her PowerPoint presentation that it's not about just looking out for women, it's about looking out for men and women. And she explains the difference between sex and gender in one of the early slides to get people on the same page there. But it was the fact that GBA is not something deployed when there is a specific need for it that jumped out at me, but rather that apparently the government policy is that you have to consider it with every single piece of legislation. This is a slide from the presentation that the government got from Carmen Paquette. Each policy proposal going to the Minister for decision, an analyst must complete a GBA template for policies deployed by the Department of Finance, conduct a full GBA where appropriate and where data exists, and include the main conclusions of their GBA in their decision notes to the Minister, including budget 2-pagers. And the presentation also writes that at Finance, the practice is to undertake GBA during the development of policy, not after, which means that every policy needs to go through this analysis of whether or not men or women are going to be marginalized. Now, even though this presentation talks about other themes like race and region and finance and income and things like this, there is a fundamental flaw in GBA, which is that this is not the only area where marginalization occurs. If we want to say that there has to be a policy to ensure that no one is going to be left out, well, let's look broadly. Let's look at race, let's look at income, let's look at class, let's look at education, let's look at religion, let's look at family status, let's look at all of these different factors. And people would say, oh, well, that makes it more convoluted. Well, there are a lot more grounds to suggest that people are persecuted or disadvantaged by government policy based on income level than there is in Canada, in the Western developed world, based on gender. And this is not just about pay equity, by the way, despite how that has in many ways been debunked in Canada and in the US, but this is about the government saying that every single policy is somehow subject to marginalization of men or women, and thus an analysis is necessary. Well, I'm not convinced, and I think that if they're still trying to tell their own employees how it works 20 years after implementation, I don't think the government's convinced it's doing all that much either. For the Rebel.media, I'm Andrew Lawton.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.